Greetings, folks. I'm weird fiction author Tim Mendees, and I've been asked to do a little bit of a reading for you, something a little bit different. And when I was first asked to do this, I kind of thought to myself, I need something goth with a capital G. And in honour of our host, I thought something with a dash of the Byronic wouldn't go amiss. So I'm going back in time to my first short story collection, The Pseudopod That Rocks the Cradle, and a little story that I wrote in something like 2 days. It's one of those that came to me as almost a stream of consciousness, and you'll see why when I read it. So yeah, get yourself comfy, pour yourself a drink, and enjoy. This is romanticising sleep. Bitter-smelling laudanum forced its way through the gradually melting sugar cube. The creeping liquid captured glittering crystals in its wake and dragged them on its free-fall dive into the green liquid below. Earthy undertones and sweet high notes merged with the sharp flavours of wormwood and aniseed to create a drink fit for a poet. As a dash of tepid water was poured through the trident spoon, the remnants of the sugar disappeared and the liquid changed from a deep emerald to a milky mint. With one brief stir of the spoon, it was ready. Webster Thomas Angove loosened his lace cravat and reclined in his wing-back chair opposite the guest-house window. Taking a deep pull on his carved beech and silver opium pipe, he gazed out at the rain lashing the bleak hills of Bodmin Moor, before blowing smoke rings and setting it aside. The wind howled, rattling the worm-eaten sash windows as he took up the glass and knocked it back in a large gulp. Webster gripped the chair and sucked air through his teeth as the absinthe scorched a trail down his gullet and set fire in his gut. And now to unlock the mysteries of sleep, those pockets of eternity, those windows on the human heart. Webster stretched out a shaky hand and put the glass on the table next to his open notebook, quill pen, and inkwell. For the last 3 weeks, Webster had isolated himself in the Cornish wilds and was swimming into the murky green waters of oblivion in search of his muse. It was a pity that the only muse he possessed was the drink and drugs themselves. Without them, he was nothing. As a latecomer to the romantic party, Webster saw himself as the Byron of his generation, when in fact he was more of a poor man's De Quincey. He lacked the transcendentalism of a Byron or a Shelley, and instead romanticised the poppy in an overly florid way that had garnered little interest and more than a little derision. Webster wasn't so much mad bad and dangerous to know as drunk stupid and irritating to be around. The movement itself had begun to wither and die as the 1830s dawned, and Webster Angove did little to slow the decay. Alcohol and opiates tugged on his eyelids like little lead weights as the soft pitter-patter of rain on glass tapped out a soothing and hypnotic rhythm. The black curtains of Webster's subconscious parted to reveal a vast abyss of shimmering green punctured by tiny specks of crystal light like a billion falling stars. There was no up nor down, simply a swirling current that dragged his reeling mind further into the nocturnal maelstrom. After a moment or 3 of utter blackness, his mind sharpened to a point and began to take in the environment around him. Webster was twisting gently in an ocean of absinthe green. There was no fairies, green or otherwise, just bubbles. Countless bubbles that formed for a nanosecond then collapsed. Each one a fragment of his neurotic personality. Guilt, resentment, anger, guilt again. Each one popped as he surged through them on his downward plunge towards the single solid object in the endless fathoms of his dream. Faster and faster he dived, until the pressure seemed to tug on his flabby jowls, dragging his mouth into a disturbing rictus. The solid object got larger and larger as it got closer and closer. His mind was too dulled by opiates to realise what the object was until he was passing through it. Webster slammed headfirst through a large arched window and into a solid wall across a narrow corridor. The window exploded in vicious shards of glass and splinters of rotting timber. As his rotund body slammed into the wainscoting, generations of dust billowed into the air, each dancing mote representing those that had came before, those who voyaged deep into their own minds to find that elusive creative spark. Many tried, though few were ever successful. Some escaped with their sanity, while others, grunting with pain, Webster ruffled the fragments of dead poets and broken dreams out of his thinning hair and struggled to his feet. He squinted through the miasma of debris and gazed down a long corridor. The window he entered through melted like candle wax before his uncomprehending eyes, then solidified into a perfect reproduction of Francisco Goya's Saturn devouring his son. Webster shuddered as he dusted his frock coat down and hitched up his trousers.
"What the devil is this abomination doing here?"
His voice echoed and reverberated, then came back a hollow fragment of its former self. The unease in his timbre had been exaggerated to such a degree that it made him wince. Webster hated to show any kind of weakness. Ancient floorboards creaked and groaned as he shifted his weight from foot to foot. Shafts of sickly green light poured through grimy skylights, casting lengthy shadows that seemed to gawk and leer in his direction.
"Come along then, dear fellow,"
he said to himself, with the enthusiasm of a drunk when the last bell had sounded.
"Let me gaze upon my muse. I want to see her laid bare and willing."
Choosing to take the left-hand path, Webster started towards the nearest pool of light. A procession of glimmering embers along the walls at regular intervals sparked, sizzled, and roared into flame. Webster jumped, shielded his eyes, as candle sconces burst into dazzling life and stretched onwards into infinity.
"Let there be light, and you'll see for bloody miles."
Webster guffawed at his own witticism, then strode more confidently into the distance. Every sconce was punctuated by art of a singularly grotesque aspect. Nightmare figures in scratchy German wood carvings glared across the corridor at Rubens's Massacre of the Innocents, as though they were getting some sort of sexual gratification from the display. Rosa, Bruegel, David, they were all here. The obscene and twisted, the disturbed and disturbing. Webster didn't like them one bit. His own artistic temperaments leaned more towards titillating depictions of buxom wenches, not this slaughter.
Beauty in tragedy, the serenity in sickness, the ecstasy in death.
Webster muttered wistfully as he tried to comprehend a vivid depiction of two severed heads by Gericault.
"Is this what you're trying to show me, my dearest muse?"
Almost in answer, the corridor began to shake. Plaster poured from around the chipped frescoes that adorned the ceiling like waterfalls and gathered in pyramidal mounds like half an hourglass. The candles flickered and danced, making his eyes ache from the strain of trying to remain focused. He closed his eyelids for just a second.
"By God and all the saints, what was that?"
Webster stumbled in alarm as he opened his eyes to find himself inches away from a dead end. He placed his puffy sausage-like fingers on the wall and patted it. It appeared solid.
"Why do you toy me so, my angel?"
He turned around and found himself staring at a large bookcase that blocked the corridor.
"What's this, then?"
He placed his hands on his hips and puffed out his cheeks as he browsed through the titles. Each one was a beautifully bound collection of poetry from every romantic poet he had ever heard of. Byron, Baudelaire, Shelley, Polidori, Coleridge, Keats. Nobody was missing, except him. Webster snarled as the realisation hit home. He grabbed tome after tome and slammed them to the floor in anger. Jealousy goosed his buttock cleft with an icy green finger, sending shivers of frustration fluttering up and down his spine.
"A pox straight from the loins of the whore of Babylon upon the wretched lot of them," he grumbled. "Why, what do they have that I don't?"
He waited for a second, and when he got no reply, he put his boot through the back of the bookcase. It splintered like matchwood to reveal the corridor beyond. Smiling to himself, Webster touched his forefinger to his lips before musing.
Purity of anger, the righteousness of rage, the sweet flower of vengeance. Yes, I see it now. Show me more, fair goddess, I beseech you. I want to see it all.
The corridor shifted before his eyes, the floorboards twisting and buckling as it bent into a right angle. Webster walked confidently towards the new corner, then turned. Before him was another small stretch of the corridor, then another corner. He turned again, and before yet another corner was a shimmering pool of liquid on the wall. He closed in and peered into its iridescent depths. Space sped on into infinity as Webster gazed into the depths of the cosmos. His lips trembled with awe as stars collapsed and black holes devoured planets. Asteroids collided and fragmented into smaller asteroids that in turn collided. On and on it went, destruction dancing its endless ballet as Webster struggled to deal with the scope of the madness. Finally, his voyage ended, and there, in the centre of the universe, he gazed finally upon the ultimate truth. Behind everything was chaos. The blind idiot god Azathoth swayed to the sounds of his perfectly orchestrated cosmic destruction, indifferent to all life, swirling with nuclear energy. His vast tendrils of burning matter directed the ebb and flow of destruction.
Perfect chaos, immaculate destruction. Webster scratched his head. I don't understand. How does this help me? What are you trying to show me?
He pondered the meanings for a moment, and then came back, still lacking insight. Tipping his head to the sky, he spoke.
I must harness my anger and negative thoughts and embrace the beauty in the dark corners of the soul. That I understand. But this?
Gesturing at the cosmic window, he trailed off as he spotted strange objects cavorting in the madness.
What do we have here?
Strangely shifting light forms, composed of skewed angles and rippling protoplasm, hunted through the debris of shattered planets like a pack of hounds. They snapped and tore at any and all organic matter in their way, seemingly insatiable. Webster watched their bodies flicker and shift as they darted from food source to food source, always in a perfectly straight line. There was no deviation from point A to point B. There were no curves in their motion whatsoever. Anything in their path was atomized.
Sweet Lord, what foul beasts are these?
The pack Alpha stopped and glowered in his direction, its eyes crossing infinity like it was nothing. A monstrous roar filled the corridor. The wooden wainscoting rattled and shook. Nails sprung from the dusty floorboards and trembled, tumbled in the air continuously as though weightless. Webster cried out in alarm as multiple malformed faces with canine snouts ending in slathering tentacles sniffed the solar winds, searching for his scent.
Stop it, I say!
Webster shrieked as he backed away from the window and collided with the opposing wall, sending one of the Bosch depictions of the Inferno tumbling to the floor. The astral window bulged into the corridor before shrinking back into itself and imploding in a cloud of gelatinous particles that fell to the floor like oily rain. All that remained in its place was a jagged hole in the masonry that opened out into an endless, yawning void.
"I've seen enough. Let me leave,"
Webster whispered in a wheedling tone. It appeared that his wish had been granted when, with a mighty crush, a door materialised where the next corner had been. Breathing a sigh of utmost relief, he ran towards it. Twisted and tarnished brass handle, he grabbed hold of it and pulled it open.
"What in the name of—"
Behind the door were two sections of wall meeting at a perfect right angle. It blocked the way in a perfect V of unyielding masonry. Webster placed one of his clammy palms on one of the walls, then quickly retracted it, hissing an oath.
Fucking hell.
The wall was hot to the touch and vibrated so vigorously that the air around it warped and contorted. Blowing on his singed fingers, Webster started to back away as the confluence of the walls started to fizzle with such a chaotic blend of colours that his brain couldn't comprehend what it was viewing. It started to radiate further and further towards the frame of the door, revealing the depths of the cosmos behind it. Webster tentatively stretched out his hand in the direction of the expanded rift. The muzzle tendrils belonging to the alpha of the hunting pack suddenly burst from the corridor. Webster screamed and took to his heels. The creatures had him scent, but were now in pursuit. The Bosch Pirint burst into a column of hellfire as his feet brushed the splintered frame. The hound was gradually materialising as it forced its way from the void into Webster's subconscious. Jagged legs with sharp angular joints slammed down onto the floorboards as the abomination howled to announce that the hunt was on. As Webster scrambled like a corpulent fox, the air crackled with static and filled with the fetid smell of ancient putrescence. Rank metallic blood dripped from the severed heads as he turned the first corner. The candles guttered and died, leaving only the eerie green light for guidance. Passing the next corner, Webster bellowed in fright as that too started to seethe and crackle. The first creature was through, and its claws skittered and scraped against the wood as it raced after him. Another corner, another rift. His lungs burned, and his heart felt like it was about to explode. Saturn snarled hungrily, his bulbous eyes swelling out from the canvas like ghastly tumours before rupturing in twin geysers of rancid yellow pus. His left foot slipped on the foul-smelling ichor, and he collided with the wall. The corridor rumbled, shook, and twisted, and Webster suddenly found himself on his hands and knees on the wall. Looking behind him as he rose to his feet, Webster shrieked as the third creature was almost in the corridor. Its fellows were about to round the corner, so he ran in mortal terror. The paintings that now hung under his feet had all started to twitch into horrific life. Blood splattered, and the gnarled hands of demons and the victims of torture and plague groped the air and tried to snag his feet as he dodged around the prints. The corridor stretched and stretched as he ran. The next corner was now a pinprick on the horizon. His guts lurched as the corridor jumped and twisted once more. Now he was on all fours, on the ceiling. Tears rolled down his gin-blossomed, blotched nose and pooled on the plaster. The hounds were slowly and deliberately stalking towards him. Saliva dropped from their lamprey-like maws under their questing tentacles. Their eyes burned with hate and hunger as they came for his rotten soul. With a mighty rip, the plaster beneath him cracked and shattered. Webster found himself tumbling down into the floor above. Slam! Webster Anger grunted with pain as he fell out of the windback chair onto the floor of the guest house. The room spun as he tried to right himself. Webster vomited bright green fluid onto the dusty threadbare carpet. Webster wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, managed to gurgle "yes" to the person at the door.
"Mr. Angove, it's me, Mary, the maid. Is everything all right?"
Her youthful burr had notes of genuine concern in its usual melodious tinkle. Getting unsteadily to his feet, Webster used the furniture to keep himself stable as he clattered over to the door. Mary winced as he pulled it open, and she caught a gust of his rancid breath.
"Sorry, my dear, I've had a little accident."
He gestured to the vomit down his shirt and the puddle on the carpet. Mary frowned and sighed.
"I'll fetch water. That'll stain otherwise."
Leaving the door ajar, Webster wobbled back over to the chair and he dipped his tatty quill, he couldn't afford one of those newfangled dip pens, into his gloopy-rimmed inkwell and started to scribble on the blank page in his notebook. At first he tried to write down his dream experience scene by scene, but it already started to melt and drift into fragmented icebergs in the endless sea of green. Crossing out what he'd written, he decided instead to list what he took from the experience. Tragedy, sickness, death, anger, rage, vengeance, destruction, chaos, hounds, Tindalos. Webster's eyebrows knitted together like two caterpillars locked in mortal combat as he struck out the final word. He had no idea what it meant, nor why he'd written it. His blood quickened as he remembered the awful beasts that had turned his dream quest into a nightmare. He could still hear their awful baying and smell their vile musk in his nostrils. Reaching out a trembling hand, he retrieved his cut crystal glass and poured 2 fingers of brandy.
"The muse speaks, all I have to do is listen."
Webster swirled the amber liquid and took a sip.
"But how to put it into practice?"
At that moment, Mary returned with a chipped bowl of some cheesecloth rags.
"Pardon me, sir, I won't be a minute."
She got down on her knees and started scrubbing with her back to him. The rhythmic movement of her hindquarters made his desire stir. It had been an eternity since he had last felt the touch of another human being. Now seemed to be a good time to flex his newly discovered poetic muscles. With his new techniques, seduction should be a cinch. Once Mary had finished scrubbing up his evacuated vomitus and got to her feet, he addressed her.
"My dear Mary, what a wild Cornish flower you are."
She turned and looked at him with a confused expression.
"Eh?"
"Your eyes glisten like sunlight's kiss on a puddle of festering blood."
Her look turned into a startled frown.
"Your mouth as welcoming as an open grave."
Mary gasped.
"Let me watch the serpentine contours of your spine as you writhe and squirm."
Her eyes flashed with anger.
"Let me bask in the eternal heat of your breath as I watch your pert—"
"Mr. Angove!"
Mary scowled after slapping the taste of brandy out of his mouth.
"How dare you talk such filth!"
She grabbed the bowl and hurried from the room, slamming the door behind her. Webster rubbed his stinging cheek.
"I was going to say cheekbones."
Shook his head. What was wrong with the girl? This was good stuff. He grabbed the notebook and started scribbling. Perhaps Mary was too provincial for such prose. Yeah, that must be it. Webster was convinced that now, after decades in obscurity, he was about to make his mark. As he scribbled on the page, the window frame rattled as the wind howled outside. The sound made his hair bristle, and he remembered the dreadful hounds. Each tap of rain was their vicious claws on wood and plaster. He couldn't concentrate after the first few lines. His mind had wandered back to his nightmare flight from those hunters from the void. One mighty gust of wind made him drop his quill. He glanced down as he picked it up and saw what he'd just been writing. Tindalos hounds, Tindalos hounds, Tindalos hounds, Tindalos hounds, Tindalos hounds. Over and over, all the way down the page in an increasingly frantic scrawl, were 2 words, hounds and Tinderloss. As he gazed at his manic writing, his eyes started to drift and cross. The angles of the letters seemed to morph, dance, and arrange themselves into hundreds and hundreds of right angles. Webster rubbed his eyes, then slugged back the brandy. The room came into sharp focus, but the page remained corrupted. He tore it from the book, screwed it up, before yelping with pain. The paper was hotter than the fires of Hades, and it seethed with nuclear chaos. He threw it into the corner and blew on his hands. The paper erupted into a flare of cavorting blue static. Webster leapt from his chair.
No, it can't be. It's not real.
The corner throbbed and undulated before tearing down the centre. Webster bolted from the room as the first of many tentacles poked into reality, sniffing for their prey. Running for his life, Webster headed for the stairs, screaming blue murder. The evil hound followed him out of the room and raced down the corridor.
Get back inside, save yourself!
The frantic poet bellowed at an inquisitive face that poked out from another of the rooms. The other guest watched as he almost tore the banister off the staircase as he tried to control his momentum. She didn't see a hound. Down the stairs he tumbled and collided with the guest house owner as he raced for the door with the terrible entity hot on his heels. The owner dropped a tray of glasses and hurled an obscenity at his back. He didn't see a hound either. Furious, the owner and Mary ran out into the storm just in time to see Webster Angove disappear into the tumble-down barn across the yard. Moments later, an anguished scream reverberated into the night sky. It was followed by a sickening gurgle that sounded like something having its soul sucked out from its gullet with a tube of organic matter. Mary looked at the owner. He shrugged, held up his hands in despair, and rolled his eyes. Bloody poets. Thank you very much. That was Romanticising Sleep. As I said, you can find that in my first short story collection, The Pseudopod That Rocks the Cradle. You can find it on Amazon, along with all my other publications, solo and all the anthologies and things like that I've been in as well. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope none of you have nodded off. But yeah, thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of the festival. And thank you for having me. Good night. Adieu.